19, 1920. Sigmund Freud is writing a letter. It is directed to Stefan Zweig, the great Viennese writer. Freud speaks to him of Dostoevsky, an author who cannot be understood except through psychoanalysis. Indeed, writes Freud, Dostoevsky does not need psychoanalysis because he illustrates it with each of his characters, with each sentence of him.
I believe that one of the key facts defining an important artist is the power to access the deepness of his inner world, and therefore of the external one, conceiving so an original interpretation of the reality, because who can understand himself in depth can see things in ways inaccessible to the average people. Freud was the first to discover this emotional and psychological power in the artists.
We are forced to offer only a selection of the numerous themes that compose Freud's extraordinary psychoanalytic portrait of the Russian novelist. Dostoevsky represented in his characters his own deepest and most hidden personality aspects. The criminals, the gambler, the sex abuser. Freud explains these choices in an admirable way, although not easy to understand for those who lack of psychoanalytic knowledge. The origin is the deep sense of guilt for having wished the death of his father in order to ensure the exclusivity of the female maternal figure. Unfortunately, after more than 120 years from the publication of The Interpretation of Dreams, the Oedipus complex has become commonplace, has been trivialized, and therefore not understood in its essence. Oedipal thoughts are, within certain limits, quite normal and common to every human being, both male and female. In the case of Dostoevsky, the artistic representation of criminals had the meaning of discharging his own personal sense of guilt, which was not resolved because the great novelist had certainly not dealt with it in a psychoanalytic treatment. Therefore, these thoughts remained unconscious, removed, and heavy.
Psychoanalytic interpretation allows us to understand the deep meaning behind the works of this great novelist. We could say that Dostoevsky's work is the way he pursued to save himself from his hidden demons, taking them to the light through the literary expression, avoiding the dangers of keeping them repressed. What makes his work simply extraordinary is the power to understand the conflicts, contradictions, illnesses of the human soul, and to dive into them instead of avoiding them, as most people do.
This psychic background had a powerful and tragic complication. When Dostoevsky was 18, his father was killed. This event brought into reality what had been set aside and the psychic represented. That unconscious desire to eliminate the father had come true, albeit at the hands of others, triggering a very serious conflict that will lead the great novelist to neurosis and epilepsy, considered by Freud of neurotic and non-organic origin.
The childhood trauma can happen to any human being. Usually these parts of ourselves remain unknown and repressed. In Dostoevsky, these deep layers were probably hidden to his cognitive understanding, but they found their way to be expressed in his unique depictions of characters. His literature is a psychological representation of the reality, an immersion in the less acceptable and most disturbing sides of the human personality. In this courage lies his greatness and his aspiration to salvation.
It led him to the habit of gambling and the resulting material misery. All of these aspects of Dostoevsky's life are explained by Freud as the need to transfer the ancient and buried sense of Oedipal guilt onto real guilt. This process allowed him forms of atonement which brought the benefit, albeit ephemeral, of relief from the burden hidden deep within himself. Without psychoanalytic experience, these explanations may appear bizarre, if not offensive or scandalous, especially in an era like the one in which this series is produced, a lover of speed and banality, which refuses the effort to accept that human beings are not at all simple. But Freud knew this better than anyone else. I'm sorry, but I can't help if this exposure to the hate and love attitudes towards the father and their metamorphosis under the threat of emasculation turns out to be unpleasant and hardly credible to the inexperienced reader of psychoanalysis.